the queen bee. Once there were two princes went forth in search of an adventure, and after they fell into a wild, decadent way of life, they never returned home again. Their young brother, who was called Simpleton, went out and looked for them. But when he finally found them, they ridiculed him for thinking that he was so naive as he was, could make a way in the world when they, much clever, had not been able to succeed. After a while, the three of them traveled together and came to an ant hill. The two older brothers wanted to smash it and wanted to watch the little ants crawl around in fright and carry away their eggs. But Simpleton said, "Leave the little creatures in peace. I won't let you disturb them." So they continued on their way and came to a lake with a great many ducks were swimming. The two brothers wanted to catch up a few and roast them, but Simpleton said again, "Leave the creatures in peace. I won't let you kill them." Finally, they came to a beehive. There was so much honey at the hive that they dipped down, that it had dipped down the tree trunk. The two older brothers wanted to build a fire beneath it and suffocate the bees to get the honey. However, Simpleton prevented them again and said, "Leave the creatures in peace. I don't want to let you burn them." Soon the three brothers came to a castle, and they saw nothing but a stone house standing in the stables. Stone horses standing in the stable. Not a living soul could be seen. They went through all the halls until they reached the end, where there was a door with 3 locks hinged on it. In the middle of the door there was a peephole through which one could look into the room, and they saw a little gray man standing and then sitting at a table. They called to him once, then twice, but he didn't hear them. Finally, they called a third time, and he got up and came out. However, he didn't say a word. Instead, he just led them to a table richly spread with food, and after that, he had something to eat and drink. He brought each one to his own bedroom. The next morning, the little gray man went to the oldest brother, beckoned to him, and conducted him to a stone table, on which was inscribed 3 tasks that had to be performed if the castle was to be disenchanted. The first task involved gathering 1,000 pearls that were lying in the moss of the forest. They belonged to the king's daughter that had to be picked up from the moss before sundown. If one single pearl were to be missing, the seeker would be turned to stone. The prince went to the moss and searched the entire day, but when the day drew to an end, he only found 100. Consequently, he was turned into stone. The next day, the second brother undertook this adventure, but he didn't fare much better than the oldest. He found only 200 pearls and was turned into stone. Finally, it was Simpleton's turn to search for the pearls in the moss. However, since it was so difficult for him to find them and everything went so slowly, he sat down on the stone and began to weep. While he was sitting on the stone and weeping, the king of the ants, whose life he had saved, came with 5,000 ants, and it didn't take them long. The little creatures had gathered the pearls together and stacked them into a pile. Now the second task involved fetching the key to the bedroom of the king's daughter from the lake. When Simpleton came to the lake, the ducks who lived there, who he had saved, came swimming towards him and dived down to fetch the key from the bottom of the lake. Next came the third task, which was the hardest. The king had 3 daughters who lay asleep, and Simpleton had to pick out the youngest and the loveliest. However, they all looked the same, exactly alike. The only difference between them was that each had eaten a different kind of sweet before falling asleep. The oldest one had eaten a piece of sugar, the second one a little syrup, and the youngest a spoonful of honey. But then the queen bee, who Simpleton had protected from the fire, came along and tasted the lips of the 3 princesses. At last she settled on the mouth of the princess who had eaten honey, and thus the prince was able to recognize the right daughter. Now the magic spell was broken, and everyone was set Free from the deep, deep sleep, all those who had been turned into stone regained their human form. Simpleton married the youngest and loveliest daughter and became king after the father's death, while his two brothers were married to the other sisters. Rumpelstiltskin. Once upon a time there was a miller who was very poor, but he had a beautiful daughter. Now one day he happened to talk to the king and said, "I have a daughter who knows the art of transforming straw into gold." So the king had the miller's daughter summoned to him right away and ordered her to spin all the straw in the room into gold in one night. If she could do this, she would. If she couldn't do this, she would die. Then she was locked in the room where she sat and wept for the life of her, and she didn't know how to turn straw into gold. All of a sudden, a little man entered the room. "What will you give me if I spent everything into gold?" She took off her necklace and gave it to the little man, and he did what he promised. The next morning the king found the entire room filled with gold, but because of this, his heart grew even greedier, and he locked the miller's daughter in another room full of straw that was even larger than the first, and she was to spin it all into gold. Then the little man came again, and she gave him a ring from one of her fingers, and everything was spun into gold. However, on the third night, the king had her locked again in another room that was larger than the other two that were filled with straw. "If you succeed, you shall become my wife," he said. The little man came again and spoke. "I'll do everything for you one more time, but you must promise me your firstborn child that you have with the king." Out of desperation, she promised what he wanted. And when the king saw once again how the straw had been made into gold, he took the miller's daughter for his wife. Soon thereafter the queen gave birth, and the little man appeared before her and demanded the promised child. However, the queen offered the little man all that she could and all the treasures in the kingdom if he would let her keep her child, but it was all in vain. The little man said, "In 3 days I'll come again to fetch the child, but if you know my name, by then you shall keep your child." During the first and second nights, the queen tried to think of the little man's name, but she couldn't. She wasn't able to come up with the name and became deeply depressed. On the third day, however, the king returned home from hunting and told her, "I was hunting out the day before yesterday, and when I went deep into the dark forest, I came across a small cottage, and in front of this was this ridiculous little man hopping around as if he had only one leg and screeching, 'Today I'll brew, tomorrow I'll bake, and soon I'll have the queen's namesake. Oh, how hard it is to play my game, for my name is Rumpelstiltskin.'" When the queen heard this, she rejoiced. And when the dangerous little man came, he asked, "What's my name, your highness?" She responded first by guessing. "Is your name Conrad?" "No." "Is your name Henry?" "No." "Is your name Rumpelstiltskin?" "The devil told you that," the little man screamed, and he ran off full of anger and never returned. Welcome to our new segment, Story Time with Sword of Asle. Have a seat. Get comfortable. Let's all read a story together. The Frog King. Once upon a time there was a princess who went out into the forest and sat down at the edge of a cool well. She had a golden ball that was her favorite plaything. She threw it up high and caught it in the air and was delighted by all this. One time the ball flew up very high, and as she stretched out her hand and bent her fingers to catch it again, the ball hit the ground near her and rolled until it fell right into the water. The princess was horrified, and when she went to look for the ball, she found the well was so deep that she couldn't see the bottom, so she began to weep miserably and lament, "Oh, if I only had my ball again! I'd give anything, my clothes, my jewels, my pearls, and anything else in the world to get back my ball." As she sat there grieving, a frog struck its head out of the water and said, "Rit, why are you weeping so miserably?" "Oh," she said, "you nasty frog, you can't help me. My golden ball has fallen into the water." Well, I don't want your pearls, your jewels, or your clothes, the frog responded. But if you accept me as your companion and let me sit next to you and let me eat from your little golden plate and sleep in your little bed and promise to love and cherish me, I'll fetch the ball for you. The princess thought, what nonsense, the simple-minded frog is babbling. He's got to remain in his water, but perhaps he can get my ball for me. So I'll say yes to him. And she said yes. Yes, fair enough, but first fetch me the golden ball. I promise you everything. The frog tipped his head back into the water and dove down. It didn't take him long before he came back to the surface with the ball in his mouth. He threw it to the ground, and when the princess caught sight of the ball again, she quickly ran over to it and picked it up, and was so delighted to have the ball in her hand again that she thought of nothing else but to rush back home with it. The frog called after her, Wait, princess, take me with you. You promised. But she didn't pay any attention to him. The next day the princess sat at the table and heard something coming up the marble steps. Splash, splash, splash. Soon thereafter it knocked at the door and cried out, Princess, young princess, open the door. She ran to the door and opened it, and there was a frog whom she had forgotten. Horrified, she quickly slammed the door open and sat down at the table. But the king saw that her heart was thumping, and he said, Why are you afraid? That nasty frog outside, she replied. He retrieved my golden ball from the water. I promised him that he could be my companion, but I never believed at all he could get out of the water. Now he is standing outside in front of the door, and wants to come inside. As she said this, there was knocking at the door, and the frog cried out, Princess, young daughter, open up. Don't you remember what you said down by the well's cool water? Princess, young daughter, open up. The king said, You must keep your promise. No matter what you said, go and open the door for the frog. She obeyed. The frog hopped in and followed her at her heels until they came to the chair where she sat down again. He cried out, Lift me up to the chair beside you. The princess didn't want to do this, but the king ordered her to. When the frog was up at the table, he said, Now push your little golden plate near me so that we may eat together. The princess had to do this as well. And after he had eaten until he was full, he said, Now I'm tired. I want to sleep. Bring me upstairs to your little room. Get your little bed ready so we can lie down in it. The princess came terrified. She heard this, for she was afraid of the cold frog. She didn't dare to touch him, and now he was to lie in the bed next to her. She began to weep and didn't want to comply with his wishes at all, but the king became angry and ordered her to do so. She had promised, or she should be held in disgrace. Nothing helped. She had to do what her father wanted, but she was bitterly angry in her heart. So she picked up the frog with her 2 fingers, carried him upstairs into her room, lay down in her bed, and instead of sitting down next to her, she threw him, crash, against the wall. Now you'll leave me in peace, you nasty frog. But the frog didn't fall down dead. Instead, when he fell on the bed, he became a handsome young prince. Well, now, indeed, he did become her dear companion, and she cherished him, and she promised. And in their delight, they fell asleep together. The next morning, a splendid coach arrived, drawn by 8 horses with feathers and glistening golden harnesses. The prince's faithful Henry accompanied them. He had been so distressed when he had learned his master had been turned into a frog. Then he had ordered 3 iron bands to be wrapped around his heart to keep him from bursting from grief. When the prince got into the coach with the princess, his faithful servant took his place at the back, so they could return to the prince's realm. And after they had traveled some distance, the prince heard a loud cracking noise behind them. So he turned around and cried out, Henry, the coach is breaking. No, my lord, it's really nothing but the band around my heart, which nearly came apart. When you turned into a frog, and your fortune fell, and you were made to live in this dreadful well. 2 more times the prince heard the cracking and thought the coach was breaking, but that was the noise, was only the sound of the bands springing from the faithful Henry heart because his master had been released from the spring, and the spell was happy. The end. The Three Feathers. Once upon a time, there was a king who decided to send his 3 sons off into the world. Whoever would bring him the finest woven linen was to take over the realm after his death. Consequently, he went out in the front of the castle and blew 3 feathers into the air so that they would know in what direction they should go. And he told each one of them to follow the flight of the feathers. 1 feather flew to the west and was followed by the eldest son. The next to the east was followed by the second son. However, the third flew and fell on the stone not far from the palace, so the third son, Simpleton, had to remain behind. His 2 brothers made fun of him and said that he should search for the linen beneath the stone. Meanwhile, Simpleton sat down on the stone and wept, and he swayed back and forth, and the stone slid away, and beneath it was a marble slab with a ring on top. Simpleton lifted the slab and discovered some stairs that led below. So he went down and came to the subterranean vault, where he found a maiden sitting and weaving flask. She asked him why his eyes were so wet from tears, and he revealed his sorrows to her, and told her that he had to find the finest woven linen and had not been able to set out and search for it. The maiden reeled off her yarn, and all at once he saw the most splendid woven linen, and she told him to bring it to his father. When he came back up to the ground, from the ground, he had already been gone for a long time, and the other brothers had just returned. And though they had surely brought the finest woven linen back to the father, however, each one of them showed their linens. Simpleton turned out to be much finer linen the realm would have ever seen. But the 2 brothers were not satisfied and insisted that his father set another condition. So the king demanded the most beautiful carpet, and once again blew the feathers into the air. And the third fell on the stone again. So Simpleton was prevented from setting out, while the others went east and west. Simpleton lifted the stone and went down to the vault again, and found the maiden weaving a marvelous beautiful carpet out of blazing colors. And when she was done, she said, "I made this for you. Carry it to your father. No one in the world will have such a magnificent carpet." So he appeared before his father, and once again surpassed his brothers, who had brought the most beautiful carpets from different countries. And they insisted that again their father set another condition as to who would inherit the realm. And the king now demanded that they must bring the most beautiful woman back to him. The feathers were blown once more, and Simpleton landed on the stone. So he went beneath the ground and complained to the maiden how his father had once more set a difficult condition. But the maiden said that she would gladly help him. All he had to do was to go farther in the vault, and he would find the most beautiful woman in the world. Okay, I thought it was going to be her, but Simpleton went down to the vault and came into a room gleaming and flickering with the golden jewels, but instead of a beautiful woman, there was a nasty frog sitting in the middle. The frog called out to him, "Embrace me and immerse yourself." But he didn't want to do this, so the frog called out a second time, "Embrace me and immerse yourself." Simpleton grabbed the frog and carried it above to a pond, and when he jumped into the water with the frog, however, no sooner did they touch the water than he held the most beautiful woman in his arms. Then he climbed out of the water, and he brought her to his father, and she was 1,000 times more beautiful than the women the other princes had brought back. Once again, the realm would have belonged to Simpleton, but the brothers made a racket and demanded that whoever's beautiful woman could jump up to the ring that was hanging in the middle of the hall could inherit the realm. The eldest son's woman could jump only halfway. The second woman Second son's woman jumped a bit higher, but the third son's jumped right up to the ring, so that the elder sons finally had to agree that Simpleton would inherit the realm after the frog's death. And the father died, Simpleton became the king, and the ruled with wisdom for a long time. And the moral of the story is, he did marry the most beautiful woman, and she had frog legs. Just kidding. The White Dove. There was once a splendid pear tree that stood in front of a king's castle, and each year produced the most beautiful fruit. However, as soon as the pears were ripe, they were taken that very night, and nobody knew who the thief was. Now the king had 3 sons. The youngest among them was considered simple-minded and was called Simpleton. The oldest were ordered to be the king to the guard of the tree for 1 year so the thief would be caught. He did that and watched every night. Soon the fruit was in full bloom. It was full of fruit, and as the pears began to turn to ripe, he kept watch even more diligently. Finally, the pears were completely ripe and were ready to be picked the next day. However, on the last night, the king's son became drowsy and fell asleep, and when he woke, every single one of the pears on the tree was gone. Only the leaves were left. Then the king commanded the second son to watch for a year. However, he didn't fare any better than the older one. On the last night, he couldn't fend off sleep, and the next morning all the pears had been picked. Finally, the king ordered Simpleton to keep watch for the year. Everyone in the king's court laughed at this. Nevertheless, Simpleton kept watch, and at the last night he resisted sleep and saw how a white dove came down and carried off the pears one by one. As the dove made off with the last one, Simpleton stood and followed to the top of a high mountain, where it disappeared into a crack along the cliffs. Simpleton looked around him, and suddenly a little gray man was standing next to him. "God bless you," said Simpleton. "God has already blessed me in this very moment through your words," answered the little gray man. "You have released me from a magic spell. Now, if you climb down the cliff, your fortune will be made." So Simpleton climbed down the rocks. Many steps led him to the bottom, where he saw the white dove trapped and tangled in a spider web. When the bird caught sight of him, it ripped through the web, and after the last thread had been torn, a beautiful princess stood before him. Simpleton had released her from the spell, and she became his wife, and he a rich king who ruled the country with wisdom. So what did we learn today in today's stories? Well, I think we learned about compassion. We learned about being greedy. We also learned that if you make a promise, to keep a promise, and don't make promises willy-nilly. I think also as well we learned that you shouldn't judge a book by its cover. Just because of someone's stature or because of someone's education or their wealth, they might surprise you. They might actually have come and help you when you need help, or be able to solve something that no one else can. So I think those are some of the things we've learned today. I'm sure there's other things as well that, and then continuing on with more stories when we continue this. I'm sure we'll get more in depth and stuff, and we'll get better at the storytelling. So I hope you enjoyed. Like, comment, subscribe, and look forward to reading more stories with you again in the future. Until next time, take care of yourselves, take care of your families, and just enjoy life and that adventure just like we enjoyed these stories. Take care of yourselves. Sword of Asle out. Bye, guys.